Taiwan is a small island at the center of global tensions. It's the world leader in strategically important chip production and the linchpin of the US's island chain strategy to contain China. And it could be the spark that sets off a great power war. But how did it get this way? The story of the Taiwanese powder keg goes all the way back to the 1940s and China's unfinished civil war. The Japanese surrender and the Soviet invasion of Manchuria in August 1945 have serious consequences for China, which has been resisting a Japanese invasion since 1937. By 1945, Japan occupies large areas of China, but has been unable to fully conquer the country, despite the loss of 20 million Chinese civilians and troops. Chiang Kai-Shek, the Chinese wartime commander and leader of the nationalist forces in the Kuomintang Party, or KMT, suddenly finds himself as one of the victorious allies. But the Japanese surrender comes as a surprise and increases tensions with other factions in China. Mao Zedong's Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, officially fights alongside the KMT against Japan, but in practice, their so-called United Front fell apart back in 1941. From 1927 to 1937, the KMT and CCP fought a bloody civil war in which the KMT forced the communists into the Chinese hinterland. The United Front never healed the rift between the two factions, and tension and distrust continues through to 1945. The CCP did little actual fighting against the Japanese and instead worked to expand their bases from their capital at Yan'an. Now that the Japanese have surrendered, these new so-called liberated areas could support the communists in a likely resumption of the Civil War. During the war against Japan, the US supported Chiang with arms and training, despite US concerns about corruption and incompetence in the KMT. Some Americans were more impressed by the communist movement based in Yan'an, which successfully presents itself as less corrupt and more representative. However, the US shifted away from the CCP towards the end of the Second World War. In April 1945, the US announced it will only recognize Chiang's nationalists. Unsurprisingly, Mao Zedong complains. We don't understand why America's policies seem to waver after a good start. As the KMT and CCP race for Japanese-held territory, the US supports Chiang with an airlift into major cities away from KMT base areas, as well as landing 50,000 US Marines in coastal areas to prevent CCP advance. Competition is especially fierce in Manchuria, currently occupied by the Soviet Union, against Chiang's wishes. Manchuria is heavily industrialized and was the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo since 1931. Its large army is well equipped and trained by Chinese standards and could be integrated into either the KMT or the CCP. For the CCP, Manchuria's proximity to other communist regimes is key. Mao compares it to a sturdy armchair, with the Soviet Union as the back and Soviet-dominated states in Mongolia and North Korea as the sides. The Soviet Union, though, provides only limited help to the CCP, allowing them to receive Japanese arms, but stopping short of political support. So in 1945, the KMT seems to have the advantage thanks to US support. The US still sees China as a pillar of its policy in Asia, and it doesn't want a new civil war. So President Harry Truman dispatches high-profile General George Marshall to oversee negotiations between the KMT and CCP. Both sides appear willing to negotiate, but this is largely for show for Marshall's benefit, as neither budges from core demands. The CCP wants control in its liberated areas and to keep its own army until a new government, including the communists, is formed. Chiang demands the CCP give up control of its territory and troops before creating any new government or constitution. 6 weeks of talks result in little more than a tenuous truce and vague joint statement. Civil war must be avoided at all costs, and an independent, free, prosperous, and strong new China be created. Both sides likely prefer war to political agreement. Chiang's reluctance to compromise is boosted in August 1945 when he signs a treaty of friendship with the Soviet Union. In exchange for withdrawal from Manchuria and recognition of Chiang's government, the Soviet Union gains the naval base at Port Arthur and economic concessions in Manchuria. Stalin believes the CCP will lose a war against the KMT, but Mao is shocked at the supposed betrayal. On paper, there is a military imbalance. In 1945, the KMT has around 4.3 million troops, including 2 million regulars. Some units are well equipped with US weaponry, including infantry firearms, artillery, aircraft, and tanks. However, KMT troops are spread out across China, causing severe logistics problems. Loyalty and morale vary greatly. Chiang's most loyal commanders get the best equipment, but they're not always the most competent. Many of his best officers were killed fighting the Japanese, and those who remain are often locally recruited non-professionals vulnerable to corruption, bribery, and political infighting. Meanwhile, the CCP has around 900,000 troops supported by militias. Most are guerrilla troops, and to win any civil war, Mao understands they must be transformed into a conventional force. They do acquire captured Japanese and gifted Soviet equipment, including 700 tanks and 900 aircraft, but there's little experience in using such weaponry. CCP commander Zhu De, who's responsible for developing a new People's Liberation Army, wants practical improvements. He initially ignores tanks and aircraft in favor of heavy artillery, improved communications, and tactical training. The CCP also operates under Maoist strategic principles, which prioritize mobility and survival over control of key locations. For defeating Chiang Kai-Shek, the general method of fighting is mobile warfare. Therefore, the abandonment of certain places or cities is not only unavoidable, but also necessary. CCP morale, coordination, and strategic focus are all better than the KMT. The party strictly controls all commanders and expects coordinated, concentrated moves against Chiang's spread-out forces. The CCP is also carrying out rural reforms, backed up by vigorous political education, which earns some support from peasants in their base areas. Meanwhile, nationalist regions suffer from economic crises, food shortages, and broken infrastructure, partly due to the Japanese invasion, but also nationalist mismanagement and resistance to reform. Nationalist control is also concentrated in the major cities, allowing the CCP to expand in the countryside from 116 counties across China to 175. As both sides expand, clashes intensify between KMT and CCP troops in early 1946, especially in Manchuria and the cities of Changchun and Siping. As the CCP expands in the region, the KMT fight to link up their garrisons. Marshall returns and oversees a new ceasefire in Manchuria, but both sides remain distrustful. Chiang knows truces benefit the CCP, but his government's return to the capital of Nanjing also brings more pressing domestic issues. However, he wants to quickly eliminate the CCP and reinforce China's post-war status as an emerging great power before any meaningful political development. It is first necessary to deal harshly with the communists and later, after 2 or 3 months, to adopt a generous attitude. The CCP takes advantage of the ceasefires to spread its influence in Manchuria, including taking control of the largest city of Harbin following Soviet withdrawal. The party is now firmly entrenched in northeast China and develops a policy of offense in the north, defense in the south. Still, most CCP troops remain in their base areas and generally give ground to KMT forces. Washington says its support for Chiang depends on peaceful coexistence with the CCP, but Chiang launches the general offensive in June 1946. KMT troops mostly target the CCP's Central Plains and Central China military districts and attempt to surround CCP formations. The communists break up into smaller groups and withdraw, with some rearguard units suffering heavy casualties. Some CCP units launch local counterattacks, stalling the advance and eliminating individual KMT units, but they cannot conduct a counteroffensive. By late 1946, the KMT secures several major cities and the railways between them and forces the CCP out of much of Jiangsu and southern Manchuria, capturing 165 towns and 174,000 square kilometers of territory. Even so, Chiang is frustrated that he hasn't destroyed the main CCP armies. The US is also frustrated with Chiang, and although US Marines remain in coastal cities, they withdraw in January 1947. Marshall blames both sides for an unwillingness to make a fair compromise. In February and March 1947, Chiang keeps up the pressure with his Strong Points Offensive. His best forces attack Shaanxi and Shandong in a pincer movement to potentially win the war, and there's heavy fighting around the CCP headquarters in Linyi. The KMT seize the city, but shortly afterwards, the CCP ambush and destroy several KMT units, including well-equipped, mechanized formations considered the KMT's finest. However, the ambushes are also costly for the CCP, who overwhelm armored vehicles with mass infantry attacks. Although the heaviest fighting is in Shandong, the CCP capital of Yan'an in Shanxi is the prime target. After a diversionary attack in the west of the province, the KMT 1st and 29th Armies head straight for Yan'an. After light resistance, Mao abandons the capital. We should not try to stop them. Chiang thinks when he has seized the Devil's Lair, he will win. In fact, he will lose everything. We will give Chiang Yan'an. He will give us China. Local CCP counterattacks slow KMT advances from Yan'an, but the KMT captures an additional 191,000 square kilometers and 18 million inhabitants. The loss of Yan'an is undoubtedly a severe psychological blow for the communists, but it's not as decisive as Chiang hopes. CCP strategy doesn't depend on Yan'an, and its loss does not fundamentally damage the CCP war effort. Mao plans for a long war of at least 5 years, so he aims to conserve and expand his forces while carrying out reforms. Meanwhile, Chiang doesn't prepare for a long war. He postpones reforms until after the war, which he expects to be short, and he resists formal mobilization in favor of local requisition. Chiang only announces general mobilization in July 1947, after it becomes clear capturing Yan'an will not end the war. The nationalists' failure to win the war in 1947 reveals the differences in thinking between the CCP and KMT throughout the Civil War. For the KMT, the war is a campaign of final eradication against supposed bandits, while for the CCP, it's part of a long-term revolutionary struggle for Chinese statehood under communist rule. Since the late 1920s, the CCP has fought largely for survival and develops a pragmatic strategy not tied to one territorial base. Many commanders are younger and gained experience through these survival years. In 1938, Mao wrote, "We should have the courage to retreat. In their ignorance of this principle, the advocates of desperate action will contest a city or a piece of ground even when the position is obviously and definitively unfavorable. As a result, they lose not only the city or ground, but fail to preserve their forces." This is an example of a difference in understanding of strategic principles between the KMT and CCP. Chiang got strategic and tactical advice from Western theorists, including Soviet, Germans, and Americans. Most Western strategists consider cities the center of gravity of strategic operations and the hub of commercial, military, and political control. However, in China, most big cities are in the east and south. The rest of China has few cities that could be considered centers of gravity in the Western sense. While the CCP still mostly functions on a guerrilla basis, wider base areas which provide the support for their mobile forces are more important than cities. Also, while Western strategy often sees military initiative in the attack, as it forces your opponent to react to you, the CCP thinks pre-planned withdrawal can gain one the initiative. Attacking troops entering hostile, unfamiliar territory will have some problems with military organization, logistics, and cohesion. Only once this happens, and the CCP has a decisive advantage, do they target specific units to eliminate. Since KMT commanders lack coordination, eliminating a single unit is often enough to stop or even reverse an entire offensive. So for the CCP, retreat, far from being an acceptance of defeat, is in fact a necessary preliminary to victory in the form of ambush and counterattack. And in late 1947, the CCP does just that. The KMT General and Strong Point Offensives bring the nationalists control of more of China than arguably any other point, but they still cannot defeat the communists. Chiang's forces are far from their bases and logistical hubs, while many troops are tied down in garrisons. As the Strongpoints Offensive was designed as a war-winning operation, the KMT doesn't know what to do with the troops now spread across the country. This short-sightedness means inefficient local administration struggles to sustain large garrisons, as historian Christopher Liu explains. Consequently, the large-scale strategic and territorial gains won during both offensives transformed into burdens virtually overnight. The Kuomintang simply lacked the resources to defend them adequately, and the forces they did have were dangerously overstretched. Meanwhile, CCP forces expand to 2 million troops and double their artillery and machine guns. CCP counterattacks start to reverse KMT gains in northeastern China, encouraging Mao to launch counteroffensives from May 1947. In the summer, autumn, and winter offensives, CCP troops concentrate against individual cities, hoping to ambush relief columns from neighboring areas. Soon, KMT commanders are reluctant to send any assistance at all, and CCP forces advance across the battlefront, especially in Shandong, Shanxi, and Manchuria. Although Chiang orders cities to fight to the death, mass defections lead to the loss of some well-defended cities in a matter of days. By September, Mao orders his commanders to immediately press gang defectors into their forces. From now on, you must change your habits of relying on supplies from the liberated areas. People, food, weapons, clothes, all must come from the enemy troops and the enemy's rear. Whenever you capture enemy soldiers, just fill them into your own forces. KMT losses are especially severe in Manchuria. The new KMT commander, General Chen Cheng, is a Chiang loyalist with roughly 500,000 US-equipped troops. But by mid-1948, the Communists push back his forces into small pockets of territory around Jinzhou, Changchun, and Shenyang, with the loss of 150,000 KMT troops. Chen has little hope of success, but Chiang orders him to stand firm and expect reinforcements via airlift. So the KMT flies in 250,000 more troops from defense duties elsewhere in China. CCP commander in Manchuria, Lin Biao, has previously been reluctant to attack without significant preparation, which angers Mao. The key to the whole military situation in the northeast lies in the capture of Yi County, Jinzhou, and Jinxi. However, it has been 3 weeks since your troops moved out, and you have still not started the attack on Yi. The movement is so unbelievably slow, you should conduct self-criticism. In September 1948, the CCP launches its Liaoning-Shenyang offensive against Jinzhou, Shenyang, and Changchun. Lin's forces besiege Jinzhou on October 14th, pounding its medieval walls with heavy artillery before bloody street fighting begins. 90,000 KMT men surrender. The CCP then rapidly swings towards Shenyang, eliminating an attempted KMT counterattack in marshland near Heishan. This defeat causes the KMT commander in Changchun to defect. The starving city had been under siege since August, and there are reports of cannibalism. KMT defectors in the city now fight their former comrades who refuse to defect. After a brief battle, Changchun surrenders to the CCP on October 26th. All that remains is Shenyang. The nationalist new First Army rushes to its defense, but CCP formations outflank and destroy it in a 9-day battle, with 100,000 losses. After a lackluster defense, Shenyang surrenders on November 2nd. The Liaoshen campaign is a vital communist victory. Communist casualties are unknown, but repeated attacks on walled cities likely make them significant. However, the KMT loses some 400,000 of its best troops through casualties and defections. These defections mean CCP forces actually grow and likely now outnumber the KMT. As the war intensifies and territory changes hands, more and more civilians find themselves under new governance and often under new threats of violence. CCP military operations run parallel to a political campaign based around Mao's agricultural reforms and urban student movements. Later mainland Chinese historiography argues much of the population supported communism, but assessing actual support is difficult. It certainly varied as the war progressed and from region to region. CCP reforms like reducing rents, redistributing land, and creating village committees do earn support, although few peasants outside traditional CCP base areas are ideological communists and local committees are under strong communist control. Despite intense political education campaigns, many peasants cling to traditional aspects of village life, although land redistribution does create new loyalties, if only out of necessity. After the farmer receives his share of the land, he will naturally think that the only way to preserve his share of the land is to follow the CCP to the very end. As a matter of fact, farmers are fearful of measures of revenge from the landlords, and it is highly probable that they will plunge in with the CCP. The party's urgent need for troops and supplies also leads to a radical program often led locally by students and political officers. Coercion, propaganda, and violence are common, especially against landlords and wealthier peasants. CCP officials encourage peasants to partake in sometimes violent public humiliations and denunciations of wealthier peasants, although some use the process to settle older disagreements. Estimates vary, but between 1945 and 1949, communist-led violence may kill up to 1 million landlords. Notable social critic Xu Wancheng claims the CCP used the crisis of war to justify harsh actions. The CCP sets fires and kills people, and in everything its talents are used for destruction. The CCP is happy at disasters and delighted at calamities. Their only fear is that the empire is not in chaos. CCP officials are also often disappointed with the amount of land and property actually available to redistribute to the poorer classes. As a result, they target even mildly better off peasants and seize their property in public trials. But civilians in KMT areas also experience violence and suffering, both deliberate and from economic mismanagement. A massive economic crisis and hyperinflation destroy savings. Between 1945 and 48, prices in KMT areas rise on average 30% per month. The nationalists make the problem worse by the forced conversion of Japanese-issued currency for KMT notes at a terrible exchange rate. Chinese in former Japanese-occupied areas are also vulnerable. The KMT sees many as Japanese collaborators, and returning landlords demand overdue rent under threats of violence. As KMT logistics break down, troops often steal food and winter clothing. This is especially true in Manchuria, which had avoided many of the hardships of earlier wars. The US ambassador notes, "Nationalist southern military forces and civil administrators conduct themselves in Manchuria as conquerors, not as fellow countrymen, and have imposed a carpetbag regime of unbridled exploitation upon areas under their control. If military and civil authorities of local origin were in control, they too would probably exploit the populace, but experience has shown that Chinese authorities of local origin, in general, never quite strangle a goose laying golden eggs." Many of the economic problems in KMT areas stem from the war with Japan. Many civilians tolerated hardship then, but in a civil war they're less willing, especially when one side claims to represent an alternative social and economic model. Exhausted KMT soldiers are just as fed up with suffering as civilians. Nationalist troops who tolerated terrible conditions in the Sino-Japanese conflict are less willing to do so against fellow Chinese. As KMT morale drops, discipline gets harsher, and food shortages get worse, CCP propaganda becomes more effective. Brothers, lay down your arms, which you never wanted to take up. Did you join the Kuomintang army freely? No, you were dragged into it at the end of a rope. Come over to us. If you want, we will send you home. Better still, you can join us and fight to free your home as we have ours. As KMT desertions increase, Mao now predicts victory in 1 year. In September 1948, CCP forces captured Jinan, marking the final transition of the People's Liberation Army, or PLA, into a conventional force. Chiang believes the CCP must be exhausted after a series of bloody battles, but he underestimates their ability to maintain the offensive with captured supplies and troops. In November, the PLA then launches the Huaihai Campaign to capture Suzhou, a major city and strategic railway hub. Chiang reinforces the city with 150,000 men, but they're soon trapped when CCP forces capture Suxian, blocking withdrawal to the south. Initially, KMT troops hold their lines around Suzhou thanks largely to their advantage in armor, artillery, and air support. The CCP invests more troops, including its new armored units, until 1.8 million combatants on both sides fled the area, making the Huaihai Campaign arguably the largest post-World War II battle ever. On the KMT side, personal rivalries and fear of ambush hinder the deployment of their forces. This fear is well-founded. While the KMT 7th Army awaits delayed reinforcements east of Suzhou, CCP troops surround the city. The 7th Army tries to fight towards Suzhou, but communist artillery destroys it during a 10-day battle in late November. Chiang orders his men to hold firm, and the KMT commander in Suzhou, Du Yuming, remains loyal. However, seasonal rain and fog mean KMT air and armored support diminish, and relief attempts fail. By December, some of the wounded are evacuated by air, including with support from Civil Air Transport, a civilian airline founded by General Claire Chennault, the former commander of US pilots operating in China in World War II. But those who remain are now eating grass and animal bones. Chiang eventually allows a breakout attempt to the south, and although it takes the CCP by surprise, they stop it in 3 days. Freezing and starving, Du Yuming surrenders on January 10, 1949, along with 100,000 of his men. One officer tells his CCP captors his last meal was his American sheepskin gloves. The Huaihai operation seals the nationalist fate on the mainland, especially since the communists go on the offensive elsewhere at the same time. From November 1948, CCP forces also target KMT positions around the Beijing-Tianjin railway line. The CCP Pingjin offensive aims to push them out and open up the way to Beijing. Once again, CCP forces ambush KMT units moving into new positions. After communist troops ambush a force at Xinbaoan, 2 CCP armies destroy a KMT relief force from Beijing, and the CCP capture Zhangjiakou and Xinbaoan. Meanwhile, CCP artillery pins the KMT in the walled town of Tianjin before PLA infantry storm the city in brutal house-to-house combat. After several costly assaults, the CCP capture Tianjin on January 15, 1949. By January 31st, the CCP is in Beijing. The city's KMT commander informed Mao he no longer recognized Chiang's authority and vacates the city to the CCP. They enter in a military parade observed by an American. Tanks, armored cars, truckloads of soldiers, trucks mounted with machine guns, trucks towing heavy artillery, innumerable ambulances, jeeps, and other smaller vehicles. It was probably the greatest demonstration of Chinese military might in history. But it was primarily a display of American military equipment, virtually all of it captured or obtained from Kuomintang sources. After the series of KMT disasters and Mao's rejection of ceasefire talks, Chiang resigns as president on January 21st. This is a symbolic move since he maintains military command. His only hope now is to hold a defensive line south of the Yangtze River. As troops, refugees, and civilians flee south and into the major cities, Chiang hopes the communists are exhausted after months of heavy fighting. Some CCP commanders do want to rest and recuperate, but Mao orders the offensive to continue. By spring 1949, they cross the river as KMT troops simply refuse to fight or flee south. Chiang orders Nanjing and Shanghai to hold out, but both cities are in chaos. Government offices evacuate, there's widespread looting, and roaming squads execute anyone they think is a communist agent. Many KMT troops evacuate the city to the south. And with Shanghai holding important economic and symbolic value, the CCP hopes to capture it without a serious fight. The Battle of Shanghai can be aptly compared to battling rats in a china shop. You must catch the rats and must not break the precious porcelain. In the end, both cities fall with little fighting in April and May. Through the summer and fall, the CCP continues to advance against light resistance, capturing Changsha in August and Changzhou in October. On October 1, 1949, Mao proclaims a new Communist People's Republic of China, essentially claiming victory in the Civil War. Chiang considers making a last stand in his old capital of Chongqing, but he finds few allies willing to fight and heads for Chengdu. But the CCP is about to take Chengdu, so on December 7, 1949, the sick and exhausted Chiang flees with the remainder of his government and 2 million troops to the island of Taiwan. Taiwan, formerly known as Formosa, had been a Japanese colony since 1895, and Chiang's arrival in 1945 was seen by some locals as a switch from one colonial regime to another. US bombing in World War II devastated the capital of Taipei, and post-war KMT officials had little inclination to redevelop Taiwan. Locals are seen as Japanese collaborators and are treated harshly by officials. When large-scale demonstrations break out in February 1947, the new authorities kill 10,000, putting them down. As refugees and troops from the mainland arrive in 1949, they quickly work to make Taiwan defensible, but also conduct training for a return to the mainland. Even so, some KMT officials do not expect the regime to last long, and a communist invasion seems likely. The CCP considers invading, but it runs into problems at the Battle of Guningtou. KMT forces repel an invasion on a much smaller island, revealing the CCP's naval and amphibious weakness. The CCP do later capture Hainan in April 1950, but only with the help of a strong local communist movement. Taiwan remains out of reach. And Mao's People's Republic also has issues elsewhere. He claims other regions that are still outside of his control, like Xinjiang and Tibet. Both are ethnically diverse and religiously distinct from most of China, with Xinjiang being mostly Muslim and Tibet Buddhist. The CCP will eventually take control of both in the 1950s, although separatist movements aided by the US remain. In Taiwan, the situation improves for the KMT by mid-1950. Commanders feel relatively secure on the island, and Chiang reclaims the title of President of the Republic of China. He also hopes for US assistance, but is mostly disappointed. President Truman announces, "We are not going to get involved militarily in any way on the island of Formosa." The Chinese Civil War never officially ends, though historians usually point to Chiang's flight to Taiwan on December 7, 1949, following the CCP's capture of Shanghai. Calculating casualties verges on the impossible. Post-war communist Chinese historiography downplays CCP losses, which were often difficult to assess in any case due to a large influx of new recruits and defectors. A reasonable estimate for the period of 1945 to 1949 is around 2 million military casualties from both sides, and 5 million civilian deaths, including from famine. Communist victory and nationalist defeat have several explanations. The KMT's poor strategy plays a role, especially Chiang's keeping significant forces in Manchuria away from their main bases. The KMT also suffered from extremely low morale. Exhaustion from fighting the Japanese, harsh discipline, and starvation conditions in some units contributed to defections. One estimate suggests 40% of KMT recruits deserted during training, while 20% of casualties may have been from malnutrition. In some cases, KMT officers physically tied their troops together to prevent desertion. Many troops simply wanted to go home. When KMT victory seemed imminent in 1946-47, morale held. But as soon as the prospect of a long war emerged, it collapsed. Communist forces, on the other hand, were mostly well-rested, ideologically motivated, and competently commanded. Post-war Chinese historians have highlighted Mao's role, but many of his commanders, like Lin Biao, Zhu De, Zhou Enlai, and Liu Shaoqi, were essential in turning the CCP from a guerrilla movement into a regular army. The CCP was also able to keep its movement and army under strict party control, thanks to the Yan'an rectification movement of 1942 to 1945. CCP officials kill up to 10,000 of Mao's real and imagined opponents and force others into line and establish a cult of personality. These purges do create a cohesive and obedient command structure, though, although earlier in the war, Mao did take advice from his commanders. Other historians argue political and social differences were more important than military realities. The CCP's policy of reform may not have created legions of dedicated communists, but they did appeal to practical peasants who suffered physical and economic hardships under KMT rule. Under its founder, Sun Yat-sen, the Kuomintang started as a party of reform and nationalist revolution, but by 1945, war and corruption eroded trust. Chiang himself complained in 1949. To tell the truth, never in China or abroad has there been a revolutionary movement as decrepit and degenerate as we are today, nor one as lacking spirit, lacking discipline, and even more, lacking standards of right and wrong as we are today. Chiang's critics, though, say he blamed the wider KMT to distract from his own failings as commander. As the war went on, the KMT relied more on urban commercial elites for income and support. This hindered meaningful reforms in the countryside. Simple KMT reforms which were carried out, like improving public hygiene, did not address the peasantry's worries about land and rights, forcing many to rely on UN aid. The fragmented, undisciplined KMT administration also meant local officials often governed in their own interest, including taking over profitable businesses and selling relief supplies onto the black market. The US worked to undermine such operations in Shanghai, but they remained rife elsewhere. Such corruption provided political ammunition for the communists, as historian Emmanuel Shu concludes. The stone that one builder had rejected became the cornerstone of the other's house. So CCP military and political organization gave it the advantage over a fragmented and corrupt KMT. But Chiang also miscalculates US intentions. China is no longer a US priority, especially as US-occupied Japan emerges as a more reliable regional partner. By 1947, the US stops most of its assistance to Chiang, a decision that mostly earned bipartisan support. Chiang and his wife then focused their diplomatic efforts on the Republican Party, which they expect to win the 1948 election. Instead, the Democratic Truman wins decisively, and the Chinese Civil War is low among US voter concerns. Still, soon after CCP victory, Truman critics accuse him of, quote, losing China. Historians have since pointed out that China was never really Truman's to lose, and suggest that this accusation is just a result of Cold War tensions. US officials later saw China and the Soviet Union as a single, monolithic communist threat, although in reality, the Soviet Union was not overly enthusiastic with CCP victory in China. The CCP's agrarian Maoism clashes with the Soviets' proletarian-oriented Marxism-Leninism, and the Soviet Union fears a strong China may undermine their leadership of global communism. Throughout the war, the Soviet Union sought to keep China weak, and even after relations improved from 1954, tensions remain. US Cold War concern with monolithic communism has major consequences, and by 1950, some of Truman's advisors want him to support Chiang's Republic of China on Taiwan. Truman remains skeptical though, but he does worry about a combined Sino-Soviet attack. For Washington, the outbreak of the Korean War in June 1950 seems to signal this very threat. One of the first US actions is to send the 7th Fleet not to Korea, but to the Taiwanese Straits to deter a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. It's a move that probably saves Chiang's republic, which will later become a democracy, and prevents final communist victory in China. For the CCP, what they call the Revolution of 1949 ends the long Chinese upheaval since the collapse of the Qing dynasty back in 1911. But in their eyes, it remains incomplete 75 years later. One of the lasting legacies of the Korean War is the American test of tactical nuclear weapons and General MacArthur's idea to use nuclear weapons on China, which was ultimately avoided. However, this showed where the new Cold War between the superpowers was headed, and the potential of limitless nuclear energy wasn't just relevant for military application. Before his death, Joseph Stalin had accelerated the Soviet nuclear program, and the vision of atomic-powered communism lived on after him. If you're interested in this topic, we produced an entire documentary series from the first Soviet atom bomb to the atom cities like Pripyat and beyond. And where can you watch Red Atoms? On Nebula, a streaming platform we're building together with other creators, where we don't have to worry about advertising guidelines or the almighty algorithm. On Nebula, there's not just Red Atoms or our other exclusive World War II series, 16 Days in Berlin and Rhineland 45 in 4K resolution. You can also watch all our content there ad-free and earlier than on YouTube. And that's not just in your browser. Nebula is available on smartphones, Apple TV, Roku, and more. And all that for just $36 for an entire year. And if you really want to support what we're doing on Nebula, the Nebula Lifetime membership is available again for $300. If you sign up at nebula.tv/realtimehistory, 1/3 of this money will directly support us here at Real Time History, and the rest will help develop bigger Nebula original documentaries in the future with bigger budgets. The lifetime membership is about supporting us and Nebula so we can realize even better history videos. By the way, this option is also available for existing Nebula subscribers. So head over to nebula.tv/realtimehistory and support us here at Real Time History directly. If you want to learn more about the Second Sino-Japanese War that interrupted the Chinese Civil War, check out our previous documentaries about that. As usual, you can find all the sources for this episode in the video description below. And if you're watching this video on Patreon or Nebula, thank you so much for the support. We couldn't do it without you. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is a production of Real Time History, the only history channel that thinks you should conduct self-criticism.